So it's lesson 5, and we're getting started with Firebase and Firestore. So I'll just give you kind of a quick preview of what it is we'll be doing, how this mostly works. So our main site for this is the Firebase Console, which is at console.firebase.google.com. You do have to have a Google account to use this. So it shows you all the different projects in here. But there's actually hooks for Firebase directly into Android Studio, and we'll go through them. So there is a Firebase option, and when we choose it, it gives us all these different services. So things like storage, authentication, it allows us to basically connect to any service that's in here. And then it kind of walks us through, there's a bit of a wizard. You know, are we connecting to an existing database in Firebase? Are we creating a new one? And then we need to integrate it into our app. So there are some dependencies from Firebase that we're going to need. I think Travis mentioned we're going to need. And this wizard will actually add the dependencies we needed to build .gradle. Now, there's one warning when we work with Firebase. This is a bit of a weird thing. You'll notice when we use this wizard and it adds the dependencies we need to the build.gradle, it actually isn't going to add the most recent version of the Firestore dependencies. Even though these are both Google products, it seems like the development teams don't often collaborate. So this tool within Android Studio, even though Android Studio, it updates very often, it seems to update every few days. JetBrains pushes an update. Its configuration for Firestore is a little bit out of date. So occasionally we'll have to manually update things. And then it gives us sort of some sample code as to how we could connect and read to the database. So Android Studio will generate this. So this is the easiest way of integrating it. We can also do this through the console. And I'll show you both ways. We can set up the database from Android Studio, and that's automatically linked, or we can create the database separately in the console, and then we have to download a specific file and add the dependencies manually to our project. You can do it either way. I'll show you both ways. And when we're setting our database up in the console, or once we've set it up through Android Studio, we get this option. It asks us if we want to start in locked mode or in test mode. So in locked mode, it basically means everything is locked down. There's no reading or writing. We have to manually enable specific permissions. In test mode, so it manages these permissions with a simple JSON file. In test mode, all users can read and write to the database. We have to make sure we turn this off when we put our app into production, although we may start in test mode. So we'll start in test mode for today. We won't really deal with the authentication piece today. I think I mentioned, so there are two products. So the original database was called Real-Time Database, and the new one that Google recommends is Firestore. So Firestore is faster, and also in Real-Time Database, all the data was collected in one tree. So basically all documents or collections lived underneath other ones. Whereas in Firestore, the structure is a little more flexible, where we can have multiple unrelated collections. And so this is straight from the documentation in the Firestore console. So their recommendation now is, if you're making a new project, use Firestore. It's faster, it's more scalable. So we can use real-time database, but it's kind of being phased out. So this product is in kind of response. Actually, the original real-time database, this was really one of the first cloud storage tools available for Android apps. Previously, before this, most apps used to actually have a local database. And there's still a popular, you might see it in a lot of tutorials or in textbooks, there's a popular local database technology for mobile. Does anybody know what that's called? And I think it runs on Android, it runs on iOS, but it means your database is on the device itself. So you somebody pushes you in the pool with your device and your device gets corrupted, it means your data is gone, right? It's stored locally. It's faster, but there's not a lot of, it's very device and hardware dependent. Anybody know what that popular local database engine's called? So SQLite was the standard for many years that most apps use this to store data locally on a device. But now more and more apps are moving to solutions like Firestore, where it's on the cloud, you have to be connected to save your data. So our permissions, just a little easier to read. This is our test mode where we're allowing read and write. And Firestore is a NoSQL database, so we'll see the same kind of terminology we worked with when we work with MongoDB. We don't have tables, we have collections. We don't have records, we have documents. We'll use this same kind of terminology. It's shared among all NoSQL databases. So this is the key file. So there's two ways we can get this file. This Google services.json, this basically contains all of the connection info that allows Android Studio and our app to reach our database. So it'll have a particular URL on Firebase with a project ID in a particular hosting container. And then it's got some other IDs, including an OAuth ID and hash. So there's two ways we can get this file. We need this file in our project. If we use the wizard in Android Studio, it will automatically generate this file for us, which is the easy way. If we choose to build our database first in the Firebase console, it will give us a link to download this file and save it to our project. So we never have to create it ourselves, or we shouldn't have to modify it. It's auto-generated. And then some of the things that are going to go into our build.gradle. So we actually have two build.gradle files. In the project level, we need this reference to Google Services. And then in our app level build.gradle, we need this Firestore. Well, when we use the wizard, we get this dependency, Firestore 17.1.2. This is one of those weird discrepancies I was talking about. This version works, but it's old. I think they're all the way up to version 21 something of this dependency. Yet this is the version we're going to get. This is the dependency we're going to get when we use the wizard. So we can upgrade this. It'll add this line, and Android Studio is going to highlight this in yellow and give us a notification that there's a newer version available. I've tried with both versions, tried connecting with both versions. Both versions will work. And the wizard will also apply this plugin, this Google Services plugin. So this dependency is specific for Firestore. If we want to use other things, other services within Firebase, like authentication, which we'll get into in the next week or two, we're going to need an additional dependency. So every individual service from Firebase you want to use analytics, well, we're going to have to require that dependency. But this is just our basic dependency for connecting to Firestore. So we're going to need this. This is kind of what it looks like. So you can actually view the data online in the Firestore console. So it will show you a list of collections, and you can click on any collection and see any individual documents. And you can import, export. So everything's stored as JSON, just like in MongoDB. And also, the one difference is when we worked with MongoDB, every document, MongoDB automatically creates an identifier, and it creates it in a field called _ID. So that's that's usually the first property in every document when we work with MongoDB. With Firestore, it works a little differently. It actually names the documents with a unique ID. So every document, rather than having a property within it, by default, it just gives it a unique name. Although if we want, and we probably will, we'll also store this as an ID property within the document. We can set it up that way. So this value will get replicated. The document itself can be referred to, but we'll still have a property with that unique identifier. So here's what some code might look like if we want to connect to Firestore and add something, add some data to it. So this get instance, this uses our Google services.json credentials to connect to Firestore. We don't have to point it to any particular instance. It just reads whatever's in that Google services JSON. So this instantiates an instance of a Firestore connection. And here on a, let's say, a save button, we use this hash map class, basically just a hash table of key value pairs. So I'm just creating this hash table with a set of keys and values. And then to save, we reference a collection. So here I have a members collection, and we call add, and then just pass in our hash object. And that will save to Firestore something like this. If the members collection doesn't exist, it'll automatically get created. Again, the same way that Mongo will work. We can insert data into a collection that doesn't exist. The database just says, oh, this collection isn't here. We'll just create it on the fly. And it's schemaless. So if we want to insert then another hash map with a different list of keys, that's fine. And then we get two event handlers, one that'll tell us, one that'll fire if it succeeds and one that'll fire if it fails. So we'll try to get this working today. We'll build a little interface, but we'll also maybe, this is kind of unstructured data where I'm just setting out a list of keys and values. This is kind of like the quick and dirty way from the Firestore example documentation of how we'd save it. We're actually going to create a class, populate the class object, and then we'll pass the class into our add instead. So we'll want to use classes for our data. You can do it this way. It's not well structured. It's kind of quick and dirty. I would recommend in your assignment that you also be creating classes when you're saving data, depending on what it is you're building. Okay. A simple read operation. So let's say we click on a button and we would just call our DB collection, and we could call a get method. We have the ability to pass in the filter here if we want to get only a subset of our data. And this would return a result object, which we could, for example, then iterate through and display. Again, this is a little simple because our data is unstructured here. We're not actually using a class for the data. When we work on this together, we'll actually use a class object instead. All right, so let's create a new project. And I know we've been creating new projects every week. This project will work on continually now rather than creating a new one. We'll start this one today. We'll do some work on it and we'll evolve it for a good chunk of the rest of the term. So I'm not going to call this one lesson 5. I'll call this one something different. The other thing I'm going to do, and I'd like you to do, is to log in to console.firebase.google.com. So most classes, you're probably going to want to open a tab here so that we can look at our database. So these are all the projects I have in my console. Yours will be empty. So you can create a project here. I'll show you this later. I actually want to create the project through Android Studio just because it's a little simpler, but I'll also show you the process of creating it through the console. So I'm going to make a new project. with an empty activity. I'll call this we'll make this a little music library, so I'll call it Fire Music because we know it's going to be using Firebase. You can call it anything you like, doesn't matter. As I said, we'll keep working on this project and adding new features to it. Over the next little while, make sure your language is Kotlin. So we'll just get our main activity. So I'm going to use Android Studio to connect to Firebase. So under Tools, we have a Firebase menu option. So let's open the Firebase Assistant. Now, I'm already signed into my Google account. It's got my little Google avatar, and if I mouse over here, it shows the address associated with my Google account. This should prompt you when you open the Firebase console. Does it prompt you to sign into your Google account? No? Yours looks like mine? Okay, so if you click right here, where there's this little picture of my head, it's the very last item to the right of search. You should be able to sign into your Google account. You will need to sign in and authenticate through Android Studio in order to be able to access Firebase. So make sure you sign in. So we'll use this authentication either next week or after reading week. We'll add this, but for now we'll leave things public. So Firestore is actually the very last service in this panel. Just scroll right down to the bottom, and here's Firestore. So it gives me a little link here when I expand Firestore, read and write documents with Cloud Firestore. So I'll click that link, and it says step 1, connect to Firebase. So let's do that. I believe here, if you aren't already signed into your Google account, it should prompt you at this point to sign in. It's not going to allow you to connect. So then I get this wizard. It allows me to connect to an existing project that I've already created, or I can create a new one. So I'm going to create a new one. I'll pick Canada, and I'll just click connect. Notice it also shows me for my existing projects how many apps are connected to those other projects. So it'll take a minute and try to connect. So once this is done, we can pop over to the Firebase console and see what's there. Okay, so it says our Firebase project is created and is connected locally to our module.app. So if I go back to my console and refresh, so here's our project, and it automatically has a little Android icon because we created it with Android Studio. So Android Studio says this project is for Android. So if I open it up, we can enable any of the services. It tells us we need to choose the data sharing settings. I don't want to share anything with Firebase, so I'm just going to leave that blank and press continue. And I'm not going to share any of this stuff either. You can choose what you want. This is just a test project. Google doesn't really need it. That makes that warning go away. So we've set up a project, but it's empty. We haven't enabled any services yet. This is just a generic Firebase project. So my second step is add Firestore to the app. So this is going to add the dependencies we need, even though, as I said, it's not going to strangely add the most recent version of the dependencies we need. So I'll click on add to your app, and here's what it's going to do. It's going to modify the project level build.gradle, and it's going to modify the app level build.gradle. It says these will also enable the Firebase core library, which includes analytics. So I'm going to accept those changes. So that's done. And then these other steps, we can try these quickly. These other steps are really just to connect and try and insert some data. So we can maybe try this, but then we'll remove this code. So if I go and look now at what this actually did, we'll see a few things. Here's our project. I'll just close that window. So here's our project build.gradle. So it's added Google services here. And in our app build.gradle, it applies the Google services plugin. And here it adds the Firestore dependency. And as you can see, it's in yellow, saying we've got a much newer version available. So you can upgrade to 21.1.1 if you want, or we can run it like this. Doesn't really matter. The other file that we have that you don't see, so this, by default, this is the Android view. So this isn't the way the files are actually organized on disk. This is just the way that the files are easiest for an Android developer to navigate. If we want to see the way they're stored on disk, if I change the view from Android view to project view, this is actually the structure on my operating system. And inside of the app folder, this is the Google services.json file. So we let Android Studio, this file gets generated in the console, and then it gets automatically added to our project. So this contains all of the credentialing that our app needs in order to actually talk to Firebase. So this is auto-generated. We won't have to touch this. So these things were done automatically for us. I'll just show you, you don't have to go through this process, but I'll show you what happens if we create the database in the console first. We manually have to do a few of these things. I'll just create one just to show you. So if I add a new project, So if I'm doing it through here, you have to create the project first. And then if I want to create a database, so when I go to create a database, it gives me Firestore as the main option. If I want the old real-time database product, I can. So start in test mode. And the things that Android Studio did for us automatically, it's going to give us some instructions we have to do manually. So it's going to tell us what dependencies we have to add to the two build.gradle files. And it's also going to give us a link to the Google services.json that we'll have to download to our app folder in our project. So it's, I suggest, easier to do through Android Studio because it will do all those things for us. If we do it this way, we have to manually create the dependencies and download the file. Both will work. So we shouldn't have to touch this file. So let's go back here to my Firestore assistant. Now, the code it gives us here is Java. However, Android Studio is kind of neat. If you paste in a block of Java code into a Kotlin file, Android Studio will say, hey, this is Java. Do you want to convert it to Kotlin? So let's go to our main activity. I'll just hide my assistant. Let's just add a button on here. We'll just give it a button of save. I'll just put it in the middle of my activity by setting the start and end. And I'll just put it below our hello world text view. Oh, actually, no, I'll just get rid of my hello world text view. How about that? So I'll just put our new button right in the middle. So just put a button in the middle. And when we click it, we want to call the default code from the Android documentation to see if it'll just save some data. So I'll just create a string resource. So my button will just say save to Firebase. And my designer just shows up in the middle here. One other thing to note. Just stop typing and listen for a minute because I spent like way too long last night figuring this out. If I run my emulator now, it should connect to Firebase. That Google services should connect. Here's something I learned the hard way. If you have a project that is not connected to Firebase and that project is active in your emulator, and then you add the Firebase connection and the Google services in, the Google services won't connect on your emulator. You actually have to do a cold boot on the emulator for it to start to connect to enable the Google services. So if the emulator is already running and you add Google services into a project that didn't have it before, you need to do a cold boot on the emulator to enable Google services. Yeah, that was a half an hour of my life gone trying to figure that out yesterday. We should be okay here because we haven't been running, the emulator isn't running. So we'll just run it and have a look. It won't do anything yet. But it's possible that some people may get this issue when we actually try the save code. We'll just make sure our UI looks okay right now, and then we'll maybe take a break. We can add the code when we come back. I'm also going to toggle this back to my Android view because it's much, much easier to navigate through our app on the Android, in the Android view. Okay. So we've just got our plain button. So it's set up. So let's take a break here. And when we come back, we'll use their sample code. And if we can save to Firebase, then we'll start setting up a class and a proper UI where we can actually save an object to the database. We will take a break here.